Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. Today I want to at least start out by talking about the Spyderco Kiwi, but I want to extend that into a little bit of a broader discussion about knives that are a little bit different, interesting, doing something that we're not used to seeing in your sort of standard knife. And I've got a couple other examples of that. Before I get into it, I'd love to ask you guys to comment down below with one of those knives that's just really kind of different and out there that you love, and one of those knives that's really different and out there that you hate. And that's one of the things I think is sort of a feature of knives like this, is that when you do something different, you're going to get a response from people, and it's not usually going to be, oh yeah, it's just like every other knife. The point is, no, it's quite a bit different than most knives, and people are either going to be drawn to that or they're going to be a little bit put off by it. So I'd love to hear some examples down in the comments. Now, let's go ahead and first give a little bit of background on this knife. Not a whole lot. It's a Celglaser design. It's been around for quite a while. This happens to be the 4th iteration of it, so it's been a fairly popular design or very popular model for Spyderco. And it fits into one of those categories where this knife is definitely not exactly what we're used to when it comes to your typical folding knife. And that's where I want to go with this just a little bit. There are a few examples in the knife industry of this kind of thing. Actually, there are quite a few examples. Here is the CRKT snap lock. Here is the Kershaw, I can't remember the name of this. I think it's the dividend. Anyway, it has a Hawk lock, and Grant and Gavin Hawk are responsible for a lot of the knives that fit into this category, where they're really just different and interesting and doing something we're not used to seeing. So we could give a number of examples of those kind of knives. I have, visiting for review, this Graham Razel, which certainly is, again, very, very different. And these kind of knives, and there are, let's list a few of the knives that are like that. If you're interested, look up the Paragon Warlock or the Spyderco Ouroboros or the Boker Grip Lock, Quartermaster General Lee. Now, a number of the really novel, interesting locks do come from Grant and Gavin Hawk. By the way, my favorite of all of theirs has got to be the strap lock that you find on the Buck 830 Marksman. That is one of my favorite sort of all-around EDC type of knives. Highly, highly recommended. The action on that knife is fantastic. And so I've got to give them a lot of credit. But you don't come up with something like that unless you're kind of willing to think outside the box. And that's where a lot of these knives come from, that have this very different feel. I've got to bring in a couple of other examples that have sort of one feature. So this 0609 from Zero Tolerance has that pivotless pivot, which is definitely something we're not used to seeing. And I've also got the Rake Knives 865 here. And again, this is a design that's a little bit different than what we're used to. It's almost a Quaken style design, although not exactly. It has a Wharncliffe blade, but it's a very long, slim Wharncliffe. So this is really a knife that has fairly standard features, but just carried off in a slightly different way. And that brings us to sort of the source of, where do these knives come from? Well, often they come from an effort to do something fairly typical. Okay, a folding knife is not unusual, but can we do a folding knife that opens in a way that we haven't seen before, So, I mean, cams are not new. So this just has like this cam lock where you push down and the cam separates the frame a little bit and then it opens. There's nothing terribly new about the technology, but it's certainly implemented in a way that we're not used to seeing. This knife, it's more about the overall design, and the grip, the way it's achieved, is definitely, again, not what we're used to seeing. Backlocks are pretty common, but this shape and this way of pulling it off is definitely a little different. Of course, the Razel is, again, a fairly standard. Now, this is a very standard knife. It's just a titanium frame lock, but man, that blade is doing something really different than what we're used to seeing, right? And by the way, it does have a fair bit of utility to it. So one of the ways we come up with, or we end up with knives like this, are when we have some kind of an effort to kind of do the same old thing, but in a not same old way, in a very interesting, new, or novel way. Sometimes these particular knives are a solution to a particular problem, right? So, you think of, sort of a push dagger or a kukri or an ulu, those are knives that have a very specific purpose. And because of that very specific purpose, they look different than most knives that are out there. And this knife kind of falls into this category. Here's a knife that has a particular use, which is, you can work with the tip of the blade. And that's definitely not something we normally see in your typical knife of any kind, really, but most especially in folding knives. And then sometimes it's just a particular feature that's exaggerated in some way. So a good example would be a lot of Elijah Isham designs tend to have an exaggerated front finger choil. You know, so this choil here will be very deep and the blade will almost be offset from the handle. It's not a new feature, it's not something that's never been done, but it's an exaggeration of a particular feature. And you get that with different blade shapes and handle sizes and all kinds of different things like that. The Espada, right, from Cold Steel is essentially an exaggerated clip point or exaggerated Bowie shape of the blade. Wow, I can't speak here for a second. Sorry, guys. But it's an exaggerated Bowie-shaped blade. Wow, why was that so hard to spit out? Anyway, the problem that comes along with these kinds of knives from time to time is that, well, let's see, there are a few of them. First off, you're going to put off a certain part of the market. You're going to get a response, okay? Here's a perfect example of a fairly positive response. When CRKT re-released this knife, they said that this was their most requested design, okay? So think of all the CRKTs that are out there, how many different designs they've done, how many have been discontinued, and then think this one was the one that was most asked for. That's pretty interesting and does tell you that people are going to respond to something that they see as being different, all right? Now, sometimes that response is not going to be the same. I've got to tell you, I have shown this knife to a few different people and the response is interesting. Okay, let's just say interesting. Some people just look at it and go like, what even is this? What would you do with it? Why would you want this? Right? It's fairly negative. Other people are like, hey, I can really see the utility there. It's kind of a cool idea, but you definitely get a response. In fact, when I'm actually tempted before I do the review on this to record some of the responses that I get, because I do get fairly good reactions when I show people this knife. And that's one of the cool things about it. But you're going to get a reaction. And sometimes that reaction is going to be good, sometimes not so good. Number two, so one is a reaction. Number two, when you're thinking about these different novel, interesting knives that we don't normally, that have stuff that we're not used to seeing, sometimes they defy convention to their own detriment. Okay, so sometimes conventions are there for a reason. People do things a certain way because it works really well. And a good example of this is, remember if you grew up in the 80s like I did and you watched the He-Man show, remember on that attack van, I can't remember the name of it now, but whatever that He-Man vehicle was called, it sort of had these, you know, oblong shaped tires that in the cartoon looked pretty cool, and even in the toy they were kind of novel and kind of interesting, but the reality is regular tires would have been better, okay? You know, it's the definition. You know, we use the saying, why reinvent the wheel, okay? And there are times when sometimes in a novel design, the designer should have thought of that. You know, why are you doing this way? Is there some benefit? Is there some purpose? Or are you just trying to be different? And if you are, is your different approach going to work at least as well as the normal way of doing it, all right? And in some cases, it's not. So as a buyer, you've kind of got to think, hey, are the ergonomics going to still be as good? Is this going to be as useful a knife? And here's a perfect example, right? This knife is really, really cool. The mechanism is different. It's interesting. You can show this to your friends and they're definitely going to be like, wow, I've never seen a knife quite like that before. And all of that is very cool. But if I was going to actually get something done with my knife, this would not be the top of my list, guys. It just wouldn't, all right? So there is that limitation that does come along where, you know, it's great that you're being different, but maybe that difference is going to harm your function, the function of your tool, rather than enhance it. Now, I'm not saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with being different for the sake of being different, but just keep in mind that you may be sacrificing a certain amount of function to get there. Okay, now, finally, let's point out that, you know, if you like a knife like this, I think it's fine, and I think you'll enjoy it, but just know that there's probably stuff out there that will serve you better. So let's come back to our Kiwi for our discussion. First of all, I'll give you a quick rundown on the specs here. This knife is a fairly small knife, 6 3/4 inches overall, 3 inches on the blade, although you do lose a fair bit of cutting edge. So there's actually only a little over 2.5 inches of cutting edge here. When the knife is closed, it's 3 7/8, so just under 4 inches, and it weighs in at a fairly impressive 1.8 ounces. So certainly, if you want a very small knife that you're not even going to know is in your pocket, this is a great option for that. The blade here is VG10. Fairly good blade steel, not one of my favorites, but definitely more than adequate. Wharncliffe, satin grind, full flat grind, satin finish. Wow. And so I do like the blade here, and it's certainly going to be a utility blade. It's definitely thin enough behind the edge that you're going to be able to get a lot done with this knife. Overall, I think it's going to perform quite nicely for EDC tasks. There are going to be some hiccups along the way, largely due to ergonomics. So we'll go there in a second. But before we get there, let's point out this is a nicely executed back lock. Spyderco does do a good job with getting their locks really, really precise. And certainly this is an example of the kind of quality that Spyderco is capable of. So I've got to give them some credit on that point. And finally, when we talk about the ergonomics here, okay, the knife is not bad, okay? Certainly it feels okay. It's not the most amazing knife I've ever felt. It's certainly not, say, a Para 2 or a 0560 in hand, but it's definitely very natural and it feels pretty comfortable. If you're cutting on a surface, it can be a bit of a problem. You'll end up using, this end portion of the blade, which is not really a bad thing. The one thing I would say here is it's not very hand-feeling. So to me, this is a knife that I don't want to go and do a whole lot of hard use with, okay? It's just not, I feel, designed for that, and it's not really comfortable enough in hand for that. There's a little bit of a hot spot created by the pocket clip. It's not very, most of your grip is going to be achieved with the front of your hand here, which is okay, but again, not the best. The thin blade stock means if you're pushing down with your thumb, it's not going to be super comfortable. So there are ergonomic issues with this knife, although it's not terrible. It's certainly not something that I want to go out and work with for the next few hours. I would bring in this as an example of, here is a handle that can really get some work done, right? It's very hand filling, it's very positive. You've got good options in terms of, whether you choke up or move down, there's no hot spots. All right, so wanted to quickly throw that in. By the way, that's also a knife everyone kind of knows about. So that should give you a good idea of size on the knife there. And so what would be sort of my overall take on the Spyderco Kiwi? It's definitely a cool design, guys. It really is. It's interesting and it's different. And if you love that, then I think you'd be more than happy with this knife. On the other hand, if you're only so-so on the design, then I think there are other knives with similar size, similar weight, similar features, VG10, backlock, whatever, that would probably suit you better, right? If you just kind of like this size of knife, then you're probably better off with a Delica or a Rat 2 or something like that. If this design just speaks to you and connects to you in some way, well then of course, this is a knife that you should go out and buy, okay? And let me add this one point in conclusion here. You could have a lot of fun and have a really cool collection if all you did was sort of focus on those knives that are a little bit different, that are doing something that you're not used to seeing. And I absolutely get why people would be drawn to those knives. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear your comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will talk to you soon.